Hi everyone, welcome back to the MOA Live Talk series. Once again, I'm Dr. Heather Hatch, and once again I am here today at our collections repository at the Museum of Ontario Archaeology. And today I'm going to talk to you a bit about digitization and archaeology. So I'm going to start with sort of explaining sort of what we do here at the museum, talk about some other applications, and then I'm going to end with a short demonstration of one of the pieces of scanning technology or digitization technology that we have here at the museum, which is the Artec Spider scanner, which is a pretty fun little piece of equipment. All right, so digitization is a really complicated issue. So there's a lot of things to think about that I'm probably not going to be able to get into in this talk. I kind of wanted to break it down into two things. So first of all, I'm talking about digitization in terms of, mostly in this case, I'm going to be talking about 3D models and how we create and produce those. But there's also, you can look at digitization as being photography, you can look at it as being digitization of records as well. So there's those other aspects that I'm not going to get into today. So mostly we're talking about 3D scanning. So here at the museum, when we inherited this facility, we also inherited some of the 3D scanning technology. So we inherited the spider scanner. We also inherited a couple of other pieces of scanning equipment. There was also the MicroCT scanner, which does not belong to us. It's still housed in our facility. And the idea behind having all of this equipment for digitization in archaeology was to be able to create the opportunity to use 3D modeling for research as well as for accessibility. So those are really the two main things that were envisioned at the time. There's also a third piece I think that it has the potential to offer, which is also conservation in a sense. So when we're talking about accessibility, having 3D models of objects gives us the ability to present them to people who aren't able to physically come to the museum. So obviously in conditions the way they are today with the COVID-19 pandemic, really nobody is able to come to our museum in person other than occasionally staff. So the ability to have some 3D models available to share gives people an opportunity to at least sort of engage a little bit more deeply than just looking at pictures. And we do have some models on our Sketchfab. We have many more that we have not yet made available. When it comes to how we, but in general, like not everyone who necessarily is interested in the archaeology of Ontario is going to be able to come to London to see our collections. And there's going to be so much more, like you can see our shelving back here, and if you've seen our tour video, you know we have quite a lot of material and quite a lot of space. There's never going to be opportunity for everything to be on display, even things that might be of potential interest. So 3D scanning gives us the ability to present that material in a different way and make it accessible to people who can't come for whatever reason. And that's important to us. It also allows us to use those models in ways that make the material accessible in different ways. So for example, we can create 3D prints of objects and make them accessible, like visually. You can share those models with other institutions, for example. You can use them for people who are visually impaired, although we've been thinking about this a little bit, and what that means today in our current context, where we're moving away from really having a touch environment. We're going to have to think about how we want to use that kind of technology moving forward. But we also are able to use these models in other contexts as well. So one of the things that we have been offering at the museum was a virtual reality experience, which I believe Katie has given a virtual walkthrough in one of her presentations. So you can sort of get a sense of what that is. And some of the objects that are in that virtual recreation of a longhouse are actually modeled based on either our collections or other collections from Indigenous materials that would have been used in a longhouse. So it's to give that not only the experience of authenticity of being in the longhouse, but to present those objects in a context that gives people more of an understanding of how they would have been used and what they might have meant to the people who were using them originally. So it gives us a different sort of experience to make people have a different kind of engagement with these objects. We're also looking at augmented reality applications for this. So being able to sort of walk around and explore the real world and have 3D models that you can engage with in different environments. So maybe being able to find an artifact or a model of an artifact where it was originally located, or in a kind of space where it might have originally been used, to again just give people a different way to engage with that material and to give them a different kind of experience and a different sort of takeaway from that experience as well. So these are just some of the different ways that we can use these 3D models that we're making at the museum. And so that's sort of on the object level when it comes to accessibility. There's also the research aspect. So what some of the scanners we have here, and this, again, we have two different kinds that we are currently using. We actually have a third that was basically, by the time the sustainable facility was purchasing the equipment, it was already becoming outdated because this technology moves forward very quickly. And we're also looking at potentially having access to another scanner, another Artec scanner in the future as well. So again, this technology moves very quickly. There's also a lot being done these days with photogrammetry, which is instead of using a piece of equipment dedicated to 3D scanning, it's using really high resolution, very detailed photographs and stitching them together in a way that helps recreate a three-dimensional object. So these are all different kinds of technologies that you can use for digitization. So anyway, when it comes to research, at the object level, one of the scanners we have here is a white light scanner that takes very accurate models. So the Artec is great for producing models. Again, this is sort of the limits of technology. The Artec is great for producing models that we might want to use in an immersive environment or that we might want to use for 3D prints. But when it comes to research, the accuracy is a little bit more limited. The white light scanners that we have, they have their own problems. They're older. They're not as good at getting accurate color. But when it comes to measurements of objects, they're really very good. And they're still incredibly accurate and useful. And so people can actually take the measurements of objects that they 3D scanned, and those can be more accurate than a person can physically get. So if you can imagine, I'm just going to steal this little blade here, which is going to be my 3D object for my test object for scanning. You can imagine if I was trying to measure this, you know, I might have calipers and be like, okay, so where is the widest point on this? Is it here? Is it here? Like, just trying to get that level of accuracy as an individual human person can be difficult. But the computer, you can tell it to find the widest points, and it will do that, and it will get an incredibly accurate measurement. So we can actually use the 3D models in ways that we can't necessarily get the same level of accuracy as the objects. And again, it makes them more accessible to other researchers as well. So there's lots of different things we can do with 3D models when it comes to research as well. So with the 3D imaging, the 3D modeling, really what we're just taking is sort of the exterior model. So what does it look like? What is its shape, which we call the geometry? What is the color, which is what we call the texture? So it's really the exterior of the object. The MicroCT scanner, which is downstairs and operated by the anthropology department at the University of Western, is actually able to take those 3D images of the interior of objects as well. So you can get a lot more, you can see insides of objects without having to destroy them, for example. You can get really good breakdowns of what some of the materials that it might be made of. You can get an idea of sort of even manufacturing techniques. Like when it comes to pottery, you can see the temper without having to slice it in half and look. You can see a whole object as opposed to just a slice, so you can see things more precisely, like where somebody might have folded something over to make it part of a whole pot. So you can see these kinds of things in this imaging, and again, it's non-destructive, so you don't need to break anything. The objects remain whole. So it's for the long term, sort of we find a more desirable approach. The other thing when it comes to conservation, and I think I've talked about this possibly in some of our other videos, is that some materials just don't survive very well once they've been taken out of the ground. And metal is a really good example of this. It decays incredibly quickly if it's not treated immediately, and if it's not kept basically out of an environment where there's a lot of oxygen and humidity. So where we've inherited a lot of collections from different sources that have not been treated, they were taken out of the ground in archaeological projects like 20, 30 more years ago, a lot of that metal is in really bad condition. And some of it's at the point now where even if we were able to afford to do the conservation for every single piece, it would just be overwhelming. So there's too much money, there's too much time, it's just a lot of resources to try and conserve all this material. What we can do is take an image of it now and have that model even if the object continues to deteriorate. So first of all, we can track that deterioration much more clearly if we have a good model and good images. And second of all, like if that gets to a point where that object is just too degraded to survive, we at least have something left of it that we can use to talk about it, to show it, and for research as well. So that's another, I think, important way that these 3D models can be used, is for conservation. So that's kind of at the object level, like when we're talking about digitization and 3D scanning, 3D modeling. There's also, you can do a lot of digitization at a much larger scale these days. So I am, in my background, I'm actually a maritime archaeologist. And so I first encountered this idea of scanning whole ships, for example, from shipwrecks, and making 3D models of them back when I was doing my master's degree in the early 2000s. So this technology has been around and has been applied archaeologically for a very long time. And I think I talked about this a little bit in my the discussion I did several weeks ago now in underwater archaeology, but the nature of the environment that people are working in has kind of pushed the boundary of how they're using technology a little bit more quickly than it's gone when it comes to terrestrial archaeology. So we're starting to see now people putting together models of archaeological sites and being able to do that like large-scale 3D scan where you can see even just in a test pit, for example, how it's going down, get these, we've seen a lot of articles about LiDAR being used to scan landscapes to even look for archaeological sites, but there's a lot of similar technology that's been used in the maritime archaeology world for a much longer period of time, and so they've got sort of a sense of how this can be done. I have friends in the maritime programs I've done whose like their whole theses were trying to create 3D models of ships based on scans and drawings and photographs of underwater sites or materials that were removed from that context, and trying to rebuild these ships based on the pieces that we have. So this kind of 3D modeling, again, in the maritime archaeology world has been going on for quite a long time, and we're starting to see new applications of it in archaeology today. There's also a lot of this kind of 3D scanning of heritage sites that's being done a little bit more broadly as well, and that's kind of interesting. And this all kind of brings me back to what I was saying about conservation when it comes to the object, right? So when we're talking about an object, we're looking at it deteriorating. We want to be able to keep it, have access for the future, and so on and so forth, and that's great. And you can do a lot of the same things with heritage sites. So I think one of the big examples that people might be familiar with is the Parma Arch that was taken out of, oh gosh, I'm going to mess this up now. It's been so long since I actually had to talk about it. It was taken out of Iran, I believe. And then it was recreated from images, and it was 3D printed. And so now there's this arch, the Parma Arch, that's sort of traveled the world as a reconstruction of this archaeological heritage site, which is a really cool thing. It's a good way of making it accessible and so forth. However, there becomes these questions about who owns that scan, who owns that data, and who's able to make use of it. So this is one of those other places, going back to my talk last week, I guess, about archaeology in theory and how archaeology can have this sort of colonization perspective, really, and not necessarily realize what's being done, is that ownership of information, that access to it, can create a sort of a power rift, right? So if you're talking about presenting other people's culture, then the idea that this data is controlled by a different source is can cause some interesting ethical conversations anyway. The other point that goes along with this idea is that, again, that sense of conservation. So you're taking a scan of a heritage site and you're making it accessible to people, and you're creating this frozen image in your mind of what that space looks like. And so it sort of solidifies what that is in people's heads and what their experiences of it, which makes it difficult which create for it to be able to change as a living, breathing site as well. So there's these different problems you can get into with digitization that I think that we really need to think a lot more through when it comes to how we're applying these technologies in an archaeological context, in a museum context, and just to sort of think about these issues of ownership of property, of whose heritage we're representing and who has the ability to present that and control that image, and so on and so forth. So there's all of these different images or different issues that sort of go around that context. When it comes to our materials, there's even questions for our own collections about what kinds of materials should we not be 3D scanning? Are there sensitive objects, like culturally sensitive materials, for example, that we want to avoid? And I mean, certainly, yes, there are. But these are the sorts of things we've had to think through here as we've tried to figure out what we can do and should do with this technology. So there's a lot of different, as interesting as it is, there's a lot of different questions that are still being answered because it is new and because it's moving so quickly. We see its application in a lot of other fields and a lot of other industries, and so there's this pressure to sort of keep up and to take advantage of what's out there. But we are, I feel, being a little bit rushed through this process about what is the responsible way to use these technologies. The other issue, as somebody who's responsible for caring for the collections, remember when you're talking about an archaeological collection, that includes all of the records that are generated about the objects and about the site. And that in this case, that includes those models and everything that goes along with creating them. So that becomes part of the collection as well. And it can generate quite a lot of just digital data. So it takes up a lot of space that you then have to think about where is this going to be stored, how is it going to be accessed, and how are these files going to be curated for the long term as well. So there's these other aspects of digitization that we really have to think through. For example, when it comes to maritime archaeology, there's a lot of these really large data sets being generated, but the question is who's going to care for them in the long term? Where does that responsibility lie, and who's going to pay for it, for this server space, for this space, and again, or for the files, and again, the maintenance of that over the long term. So there's, again, a lot of these questions that we have to think through about how we're using these files, why we're making them, and how they're going to get used, and so forth. So, excuse me, I'm just talking a lot. These are some of the issues that we've been grappling with here for a number of years now, and we do think we have some solutions. We have, I think, a good sense of how we're storing our own files and caring for them, protocols on like what we are scanning and why, and how that material gets used in place. So I think we're sort of at least on a good path there. So I'm not going to say that we have all the answers, but it is, I think, helpful at least to know, have a sense of our own ignorance at the very least, and to start to sort of move towards solving some of these questions and coming up with answers to some of these questions as well. There's been some interesting work done by students at Western University. Beth Compton, I think, yes. I guess I'm just not sure if she's finished or not. She was working on a PhD project where she was taking 3D printed materials to sort of get a sense of how people feel about these sort of recreations of material culture, and sort of how do people feel about them from different kinds of community contexts. Is it better if they are full color? Do people want to know if things are being, if they're not being faced with an original object? Is it better to have them just like a solid white so that that's clear? Do they have a shared meaning with the original objects? All these different kinds of questions that are sort of coming out of all these different digitization technologies, which I think are really interesting. So there's lots of work to be done. If anybody is out there looking for cool projects to do in archaeology and sort of questions to think through, there's lots there, and we're happy to help students who are interested in using our technology and to promote this kind of research as well. But on to the second part of this talk, which is to show you how some of this technology actually works. So with the Spider scanner, so this is again the Artec Spider scanner, it's a handheld scanner. It does look very much like an iron. It's pretty much everyone's first comment, looks like an iron. Yes. And it's great because it gives you the flexibility to be able to move around your object. As I said, the accuracy level of the scan is not quite as high as some of the other technology that's out there, but for most purposes, for most things you want to do, especially if you're interested in making 3D prints, it's perfect for those uses. So it's what it's got here. You can see all these different little things. So there's a number of cameras, one of which is actually, this is a projector here. So it's projecting a grid onto the object, and the other scanners we have that are using very similar kinds of technology. This is using a blue light, the other ones are white lights. What that means basically is that there are certain colors that they can't actually pick up. So with this one, it has a difficult time picking up a true red color. The other ones, the white lights, can't really see black. And that just has to do with the light spectrum that they're operating in. So it projects a grid onto your object, and then all these other ones here are cameras that are recording. And so they're taking, they're using that grid to triangulate the position in space of the object that they're seeing. And then the scanner does all the software rather, does all that triangulation, gosh, I can't speak, to create the shape of it. And then this also captures what we call the texture, so the color of it as well. So remember, when it comes to 3D scans and 3D models, those are two separate things. The geometry is the shape, and the texture is the color. So one of the big advantages of the Artec that I think is really fun and really interesting and just makes it a very, again, convenient machine to use is that it does it very quickly. So I've got this set up here, so hopefully you'll be able to see. I'm going to turn it away from me. You can see I've got my object here, and the reason we use this foam that you're seeing here is because it refracts light. So the scanner doesn't pick up this foam, which makes it really easy or really great for us to scan on it, because we don't have to worry about it picking up the table and then having to clean that all off. So I've got my object set here. This is actually on a turntable. Now the Artec is handheld, so it's not necessary. I can move around the object if I need to get it from different angles. But the turntable makes it a little bit easier because I can just hold it in place and have the object turn and just do like small basic like adjustments as needed to make sure I'm getting the whole thing. And it's still a lot easier. You can see my computer screen in the background there, and that's because the Artec actually creates your model as you're scanning. So hopefully this is all set up and going to work for me properly, and you'll be able to see something of it going on in the background here. So here we go. First thing that happens is I'm just going to find where I need to hold this. Pardon me while I shift my chair. So you can sort of see on the screen there's an object. I think I just need to turn that just a little bit more. So you can sort of see it already. So that's not scanning, that's just the preview. Unfortunately, here, maybe I'll turn it back. So there's sort of like to figure out how far away to hold the scanner is as much an art as anything else. So it's a matter of practice. And I'm doing this left-handed right now just because that's how my demo is set up. So hopefully it's not gonna get too messy for you. So now I'm gonna actually start to scan it. And you can see it's outlined here in green. And that's actually scanning the whole object. Oh, no, I've messed it up. Try to switch hands. I'm just going to stand up for a minute and come over here so I can do this a little bit more clearly. So but you can still see on the screen there we've got something. It's a little bit messy because I moved too suddenly, so it's kind of got two shapes overlapped. And we can just do it again. Pull it back here so I've got my object coming up on the screen. And now I'm going to show you how the, here we go. Come on. There we go. How the turntable can work. So first I'm just going to tilt up a little bit so I can make sure I'm getting the top. So this is actually a pretty chunky blade that we're looking at right here. So it's not too bad. But with some of the really thin objects, like thin projectile points, for example, it's difficult for this scanner to actually keep track of the whole thing once it comes along to the edge. I don't think we're going to have a problem with this one here, just because, again, it's so thick, there will be something for it to track. But on some of the really thin objects, you can completely lose track of it. It basically becomes invisible to the scanner once it is looking at it right on that edge. So it can be difficult for you to get a whole scan all the way around. So you kind of maybe need to do the front and the back. The other thing you can do, and I'll show you here in a second just for, just as an example, but you can see how this model is coming together actually pretty nicely. Now, if I want to get the whole object, what I would need to do is then turn it over. I'm just gonna get this so I can get the bottom of, so there's a triangle. Yeah. So if I wanted to get the whole object, I would have to turn it over in its little bed where it's sitting right now, and then get the other side where it's set in there, and then sort of take those two halves and put them together. That's not too bad. So I'm going to stop it there. And I'm just going to hide this first one we did. And so this is basically, hopefully you can see, I'll just turn this a little bit more clearly. Unfortunately, I can't zoom in. But you can see I've got pretty much that whole blade scanned just in that maybe like 5 minutes that I was talking you through. I can blow this up a little bit, and you can see it's got some of the color there. And this is just the initial steps. So you can see some of this stuff scattered down here. So as I said, the base reflects light, or refracts light a little bit, so we're not getting like, it's not just on a whole plane. You're just getting some little scattered pieces here and there, so which is really kind of much easier for us to clean up. And this software actually has an autopilot function, so I could just tell it to finish and clean this whole thing up, and it would basically go through all those steps on its own. So it's really quite nice software. It's very easy to use. So there's a little bit of a learning curve in terms of how to actually hold the scanner properly and these sorts of issues. But once you've got a sense of that, then it goes quite easily. So I'll show you what I was talking about. If you can imagine, I'm just gonna, the edge here, again, this one's really nice and thick and chunky, so it's less of an issue. But some of these, some projectile points are very thin. And so if it's facing the camera head on, it's really not seeing anything on the sides. And so it just basically loses complete track of where it is. So one of the tricks we've learned, if you're ever 3D scanning a projectile point, and this is a concern for you, is you can actually take some other objects and put them into this scan as well. And so that way, even if your scanner loses track of your projectile point, it's got some other frame of reference. So I'm just going to do another scan here just so you can get a sense of what I'm talking about. There we go. So you can see it's picking up those other objects in the scan as well right now. And so that would help if you have a really narrow object. You can use those, you know, in this case it's an eraser and a piece of sponge, because that happens to be what we have around, and they do work quite well. But you can use those other objects to help it keep its tracking, so that it's going to be able to trace once this thing is on its edge and it becomes more or less invisible. It's still going to be, once it makes that turn around, would still be able to find those sides and match them up properly. And then later on, you can just delete these objects out so that you don't have them in your final scan. You can just, you know, once you have everything aligned and it knows what it's looking at, you can just completely delete them, and then you're left with just your object model here as well. So I'm just going to go back to me here. I'm not going to walk through the whole process of finishing a model, because it can take a while, and if I haven't got my scans right, it probably will. I'd also probably want to finish doing the other side of it, but I think you can get a sense, again, just of how easy, really, and quite nice this technology is to use. And we don't have somebody who's dedicated to doing 3D scanning right now. I've done quite a lot of it, so I'm used to the scanner, but it's often like months at a time between when I'm actually using it for anything. And usually when I am using it, it's to train somebody else who's going to be using it more frequently. But even with that, the fact that I have not used this thing in months, it was still pretty easy for me to just pick it up again and pretty quickly get a scan of a single object. So it's really something that we're very lucky to have in any case. So I hope that has been interesting. You've got some idea of what we're doing with 3D scanning, some of the issues around it, some of the benefits, what you can do with it. So hopefully that was of interest, and I'll see you on Thursday. I believe I'm going to be talking about archaeology and climate change. So some of the ways that first we can look at climate change through archaeology, and then some of the ways that climate change is affecting archaeology today, both good and bad. So thank you again, and once more, if you have the ability and have been appreciating these talks, we would very much appreciate you if you're able to drop us a donation. I can leave a link in the comments. If you also can find it on our webpage, if you go to support us, you'll be able to find the donation page there, and you can just make a donation through PayPal. And thanks again, and I'll see you on Thursday.